The Carnival Triumph was supposed to be a dream vacation. 3,000 passengers had boarded the massive cruise ship in February 2013, expecting 4 days of Caribbean paradise. Instead, they found themselves trapped in what survivors would later describe as a floating hell that tested the very limits of human endurance and sanity. It started with a simple engine fire on February 10th, while the ship was sailing through the Gulf of Mexico. At first, passengers barely noticed, just some smoke and a brief power outage. The crew assured everyone it was under control. But as the hours passed, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. The Triumph was dead in the water, drifting helplessly in the vast expanse of ocean, with no power, no air conditioning, and no working toilets for thousands of trapped souls. What followed was a descent into chaos that would make headlines worldwide and leave psychological scars on passengers that persist to this day. Without power, the ship's sewage systems failed catastrophically. Raw waste began flooding the lower decks, seeping into cabins and pooling in hallways. The stench became so overwhelming that passengers tied shirts around their faces like makeshift gas masks. But nothing could block out the horrific smell that permeated every inch of the vessel. The psychological horror began almost immediately. In the suffocating heat, with temperatures soaring above 100 degrees in many cabins, panic set in. Passengers described the feeling of being buried alive, trapped in a metal coffin floating in an endless sea. The normal sounds of a cruise ship, the hum of engines, the whoosh of air conditioning, were replaced by an eerie silence broken only by crying children, arguments breaking out, and the constant sound of water dripping from broken pipes. Food became scarce within 24 hours. The crew, working without proper refrigeration, struggled to serve cold sandwiches and warm soda to increasingly desperate passengers. Long lines formed for the few working bathrooms on upper decks, with waits of over 2 hours becoming common. People began relieving themselves in hallways, elevators, and even their own cabins out of desperation. The ship was transforming into something that defied every notion of civilized society. Sleep became nearly impossible. Without air conditioning, the interior cabins became furnaces. Passengers dragged mattresses onto open decks, creating tent cities under the stars. But even outside, there was no escape from the smell, the heat, or the growing sense of dread. Many reported nightmares about never leaving the ship, about dying slowly in the middle of the ocean while rescue ships passed them by. The most disturbing accounts came from passengers trapped on the lower decks, where the sewage problem was worst. Water, if it could even be called that, sloshed through corridors with every wave. Families with small children were forced to wade through waist-deep liquid to reach the upper decks. Some passengers broke down completely, sobbing uncontrollably, or staring blankly into space. Others became aggressive, fighting over food or bathroom access. One passenger, Anne Barlow, later described the psychological toll. "You felt like an animal. All pretense of civilization just disappeared. People were doing things they would never normally do, and you started to wonder if you would too. The smell got into your clothes, your hair, your skin. Even now, certain smells trigger panic attacks." The ship's PA system, running on backup power, became a source of both hope and dread. Each announcement promised rescue was coming, but as hours turned into days, passengers stopped believing. Some began making peace with the idea they might die at sea. Others started exhibiting signs of what psychologists would later identify as acute stress disorder, confusion, emotional numbness, and detachment from reality. By the third day, the situation had deteriorated beyond imagination. Passengers were using plastic bags as toilets, then throwing them overboard. The few working faucets produced brown water that tasted of rust and worse. Children were crying constantly from hunger and heat exhaustion. Medical emergencies were mounting, but the ship's small medical facility was overwhelmed and running out of supplies. The most terrifying aspect wasn't just the physical conditions, it was the complete helplessness. Passengers could see the ocean stretching endlessly in every direction, could see planes flying overhead that couldn't help them, could hear radio reports about their plight while feeling utterly abandoned. The ship had become a prison with no possibility of escape except rescue or death. When tugboats finally reached the Triumph after 5 days, passengers wept with relief. But the nightmare wasn't over. The towing process took another 8 hours, during which the ship rocked violently, making the sewage problem even worse. Passengers lined the railings, desperate for any sign of land, many having eaten nothing but raw onions and stale bread for days. The docking in Mobile, Alabama, on February 14th, Valentine's Day, was chaotic. Passengers kissed the ground, literally. Many were suffering from dehydration, heat exhaustion, and psychological trauma. Some had to be helped off the ship, too weak to walk. Others ran as soon as they felt solid ground, never looking back at the vessel that had become their floating prison. The aftermath revealed the full extent of the horror. Passengers filed hundreds of lawsuits describing not just physical discomfort, but lasting psychological damage. Many reported being unable to sleep in enclosed spaces, having panic attacks at the smell of sewage, or experiencing nightmares about being trapped on ships. Some developed agoraphobia, or conversely, claustrophobia, so severe they couldn't enter elevators or small rooms. The Carnival Triumph incident became known as the poop cruise in media reports, but this nickname minimized the genuine trauma experienced by those aboard. It wasn't just about inconvenience. It was about the complete breakdown of everything that separates civilization from chaos, played out in the middle of the ocean with no escape possible. For 5 days, 3,000 people lived through a real-life nightmare that tested every assumption about safety, dignity, and human nature itself. The ship was eventually renamed and returned to service after extensive repairs. But for those who lived through those 5 days, in February 2013, the Carnival Triumph will forever remain a symbol of how quickly paradise can become hell, and how thin the line really is between civilization and chaos when you're trapped in the middle of an endless, indifferent ocean. The Royal Caribbean's grandeur of the seas was cutting through the Atlantic waters in perfect weather when passengers on Deck 6 began reporting something that chilled the crew to their bones. It was March 2018, and what started as isolated incidents would soon become a pattern so disturbing that it would haunt everyone aboard for the rest of their lives. It began with Margaret Chen, a 67-year-old grandmother from Seattle, who simply vanished from her cabin on the 3rd night of the cruise. Her husband Robert woke up around 3 a.m. to find her side of the bed empty and cold. The bathroom door was open, the lights off. Her reading glasses sat folded on the nightstand exactly where she'd left them. Her shoes were still by the door, her purse untouched. It was as if she had simply evaporated into thin air. The crew launched an immediate search of the 916-foot vessel, checking every restaurant, lounge, deck, and storage area. Security reviewed hours of footage from the ship's extensive camera system. But Margaret Chen had not been captured on a single frame after she entered her cabin at 10:30 p.m. the previous evening. She had simply disappeared from a locked room with no balcony, 7 decks above the churning Atlantic Ocean. The search continued through the next day as the ship maintained its course. Passengers were questioned, crew members interviewed, but no one had seen or heard anything unusual. The official theory was that Margaret had somehow left her cabin undetected and fallen overboard, though how someone could exit a locked interior cabin without triggering any of the ship's sophisticated monitoring systems remained unexplained. Her family was devastated, but the cruise continued. Then it happened again. 3 nights later, David Kowalski, a 45-year-old engineer from Detroit, disappeared from his cabin on Deck 6. His roommate, a longtime friend, woke to find David's bed unslept in. Like Margaret, all of David's belongings remained untouched. His wallet contained over $300 in cash. His expensive watch sat on the dresser. His passport was still in the room safe. The security footage showed him entering his cabin at 11:47 p.m., but never leaving. Panic began to spread among the passengers. The disappearances weren't random. They were both from Deck 6, both from interior cabins, and both had occurred in the early morning hours between 3 and 4 a.m. Passengers on that deck began sleeping in the public areas, afraid to return to their rooms. Some demanded to be moved to different decks, but the ship was at full capacity. The crew tried to maintain normalcy, but whispers spread through the vessel like wildfire. Passengers talked in hushed tones about the ghost deck, about something stalking the corridors of Level 6 in the dead of night. The rational explanations, sleepwalking, suicide, foul play, seemed increasingly inadequate given the impossible circumstances of both disappearances. On the 7th night of the cruise, Lisa Rodriguez couldn't sleep. The 34-year-old teacher from Phoenix had specifically requested a cabin on Deck 6 because it was cheaper, but now she regretted that decision deeply. She lay in her narrow bed, listening to every creak and groan of the massive ship as it cut through the Atlantic swells. Around 2:30 a.m., she heard something that made her blood freeze. Footsteps in the corridor outside, but they weren't normal footsteps. They were wet, like someone walking in soaked clothing, leaving puddles with each step. Lisa held her breath and listened. The footsteps moved slowly down the hallway, pausing at each door. She could hear water dripping, a steady plink, plink, plink that seemed to echo through the walls. When the sound stopped directly outside her door, she nearly screamed. The handle turned slowly, testing the lock. For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, something waited outside her door in absolute silence. When morning came, Lisa immediately reported the incident to security. They found water in the hallway, not the clean water that might come from a leaking pipe, but seawater, with bits of seaweed and the unmistakable smell of the deep ocean. The crew mopped it up quickly and claimed it was condensation, but passengers who saw it knew better. Seawater doesn't condense on interior decks of a cruise ship. The next disappearance occurred 2 nights later. James Morrison, a retired police officer from Baltimore, had volunteered to keep watch in the Deck 6 hallway, convinced that someone aboard the ship was responsible for the vanishing passengers. He positioned himself in an alcove near the elevator, with a clear view of the entire corridor. At 3:17 a.m., according to his final text message to his wife, he reported something coming down the hall. James Morrison was never seen again. His phone was found on the floor of the alcove, the screen cracked as if it had been dropped. The security cameras showed him at his position until 3:15 a.m., then nothing but an empty hallway for the rest of the night. Whatever had taken him left no trace except for a trail of seawater leading to a maintenance door that opened onto an exterior deck, a door that required a special key card that James didn't possess. By now, the remaining passengers on Deck 6 had either moved to other accommodations or were sleeping in the ship's public areas. The crew began avoiding that deck, except when absolutely necessary. Strange reports multiplied, elevator doors opening on Deck 6 to reveal flooded corridors that were dry minutes later, sounds of splashing water coming from empty cabins, and the persistent smell of rotting seaweed that would appear and disappear without warning. The most disturbing incident occurred when a maintenance worker, responding to reports of water damage, found cabin 6247, Margaret Chen's former room, completely flooded with seawater. The water was waist-deep and ice-cold, filled with pieces of seaweed and small marine creatures that had no business being 7 decks above the ocean. When he fled and returned with a supervisor 20 minutes later, the cabin was completely dry, with no sign that water had ever been present. Passengers began sharing stories that the crew desperately tried to suppress. People reported seeing figures in the corridors of Deck 6 during the night, pale, waterlogged shapes that moved with the jerky, unnatural gait of something that had spent too long underwater. The figures wore cruise ship attire, but their clothes hung from their bodies like seaweed, constantly dripping, despite being in the middle of the ship. Maria Santos, a nurse from Miami, encountered one of these figures directly. Unable to sleep, she had decided to walk the ship's upper decks around 4 a.m. When the elevator stopped at Deck 6, the doors opened to reveal a soaked woman standing in the hallway. The woman turned toward Maria, and she recognized the face from the missing person flyers posted throughout the ship. It was Margaret Chen. But Margaret's eyes were completely white. Her skin had the blue-gray pallor of someone who had drowned, and seawater streamed constantly from her mouth and nose. Maria screamed and frantically pressed the door close button, but for several terrifying seconds, the elevator wouldn't respond. Margaret began walking toward the elevator, leaving wet footprints on the carpet, her waterlogged clothes making squishing sounds with each step. Just as she reached the doors, they finally closed. When Maria reported the incident, security claimed the elevator logs showed it had never stopped at Deck 6 during her ride. But Maria knew what she had seen. The final night of the cruise brought the most horrifying revelation. A brave passenger named Tom Bradley, a former Navy SEAL, decided to spend the night on Deck 6 with night vision equipment, determined to document whatever was happening. His footage, later leaked online, despite the cruise line's efforts to suppress it, showed something that defied all rational explanation. At 3:33 a.m., the corridor began filling with seawater, but the water wasn't flowing in from anywhere. It was simply materializing, rising from the carpet itself, as if the ship were sinking from within. As the water reached knee-deep, figures began emerging from the cabin doors. Margaret Chen, David Kowalski, James Morrison, and others. They moved through the flooded corridor like they were underwater, their movements slow and graceful, despite the fact that they were walking on a carpeted hallway. Tom's camera captured their faces clearly, pale, bloated, with that distinctive blue-gray color of drowning victims. But most disturbing was their behavior. They weren't random or chaotic. They moved with purpose, gathering in the hallway as if attending some kind of meeting or ceremony. They turned toward Tom's hiding spot in perfect unison, their white eyes staring directly at the camera, and began walking toward him. The footage ended abruptly. Tom Bradley was found the next morning in his cabin on Deck 8, catatonic and suffering from what doctors described as severe hypothermia and saltwater poisoning, despite never having been near the ocean. He never recovered mentally and was institutionalized shortly after the cruise ended. His camera was found in cabin 6247, sitting in a puddle of seawater that maintenance crews insisted was impossible. When the Grandeur of the Seas docked in Fort Lauderdale, the cruise line immediately sealed off Deck 6, claiming water damage from a burst pipe. Passengers were offered significant compensation in exchange for signing non-disclosure agreements. Most refused to discuss their experiences publicly, but the whispers persisted. The ship underwent extensive renovations, with Deck 6 being completely gutted and rebuilt. But the horror didn't end there. Subsequent cruises on the Grandeur of the Seas reported similar incidents. Always on Deck 6, always between 3 and 4 a.m. Passengers and crew members continued to disappear, and those who remained spoke of seeing the same waterlogged figures wandering the corridors at night. Eventually, the cruise line stopped booking passengers on Deck 6 altogether, claiming it was being used for storage. Maritime experts have no explanation for what happened aboard the Grandeur of the Seas during that March 2018 cruise. The official reports cite equipment malfunctions and passenger accidents, but those who were there know the truth. Some dark force from the depths of the Atlantic had somehow infiltrated the ship, claiming passengers one by one and adding them to its crew of the drowned. The sea, which has claimed countless victims over the millennia, had found a way to reach up and pull people down, even when they were floating safely 7 decks above the waves. The Norwegian Epic was 3 days into its 7-day Caribbean cruise when passengers began noticing something disturbing about the midnight buffet on Deck 12. What started as whispered complaints about strange tastes and unsettling smells would evolve into a nightmare that turned the ship's finest dining experience into a feeding ground for something that defied human understanding. It began with Sandra Williams, a food blogger from Portland who prided herself on her refined palate. She had specifically chosen this cruise for its renowned culinary program and was documenting every meal for her popular blog. On the 3rd night, she visited the midnight buffet around 11:45 p.m., expecting the usual spread of gourmet offerings. Instead, she found something that made her stomach turn. The food looked normal at first glance: elegant displays of carved meats, fresh seafood, and elaborate desserts arranged under warm lighting. But as Sandra approached the serving stations, she noticed an odd smell beneath the usual aromas of cooked food. It was organic and unpleasant, like meat that had been left out too long, mixed with something metallic that reminded her disturbingly of blood. When she tried to take a photo of a particularly elaborate roast, her camera captured something that shouldn't have been there. In the digital image, the meat appeared to be moving slightly, as if something was writhing just beneath the surface. She took several more photos, but they all showed the same disturbing phenomenon. When she looked at the actual food with her naked eyes, it appeared perfectly still. Sandra decided to skip the midnight buffet that night, but she couldn't shake what she had seen. The next evening, curiosity got the better of her. She returned with her camera, determined to document whatever was happening. This time, the smell was stronger, and she noticed other disturbing details. The serving utensils appeared to be slightly damp, with something that wasn't water, something darker and more viscous. When she looked closely at the carved ham, she could swear she saw tiny puncture marks in the meat, as if something with small, sharp teeth had been feeding on it. But the most unsettling discovery came when she observed the other passengers at the midnight buffet. There were perhaps 30 people in the dining area, all eating with an unusual intensity. They weren't making conversation or enjoying the social aspect of dining. Instead, they ate mechanically, almost frantically, their eyes glazed over as they consumed plate after plate of food. Some had sauce or juices running down their chins, but they didn't seem to notice or care. Sandra tried to speak to a middle-aged man who was on his 4th helping of prime rib. When he turned to look at her, she gasped. His pupils were completely dilated, turning his eyes into black pools. His teeth appeared sharper somehow, and when he smiled, she saw that his gums were bleeding. He didn't respond to her questions, just turned back to his food and continued eating with disturbing voracity. Frightened, Sandra left the buffet and went to her cabin, but she couldn't sleep. Around 3 a.m., she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. lots of footsteps, as if a crowd was moving through the ship. She peered out her peephole and saw dozens of passengers walking purposefully toward the elevators, all heading in the direction of Deck 12. Their movements were synchronized in an unnatural way, like they were being drawn by some invisible force. The next day, Sandra tried to report her concerns to the ship's staff, but they dismissed her observations as imagination or seasickness. However, she noticed that several passengers who had been at the midnight buffet looked pale and sickly during the day. They picked at their regular meals, but seemed to come alive only when evening approached. She also observed that the ship's medical center had become busier, with more people complaining of stomach problems and unusual cravings. Dr. Patricia Martinez, the ship's physician, was indeed seeing an increase in strange symptoms. Passengers reported intense hunger that couldn't be satisfied by normal meals, unusual sensitivity to light during the day, and disturbing dreams about eating raw meat. Some complained of their teeth feeling loose or different somehow. Most disturbing were the blood tests she ran on several patients. Their red blood cell counts were abnormally low, as if something was consuming their blood from within. On the fifth night of the cruise, Sandra decided to stake out the midnight buffet from a hidden vantage point. She positioned herself behind a pillar in the adjacent lounge area, where she could observe without being seen. What she witnessed that night would haunt her for the rest of her life. The passengers who attended the midnight buffet weren't just eating anymore. They were transforming. As they consumed the tainted food, their behavior became increasingly animalistic. They abandoned utensils and began eating with their hands, tearing at meat with their teeth. Their movements became more fluid and predatory. Most horrifying of all, she could see that their teeth were actually changing, becoming longer and sharper as they ate. But the worst revelation came when she focused her camera's zoom lens on the food itself. The elaborate dishes weren't just moving, they were alive. The carved roasts writhed with what looked like parasitic worms. The seafood displays crawled with creatures that weren't quite shrimp or crab, and the desserts pulsed with an organic rhythm that suggested they were somehow breathing. The passengers consuming these nightmare delicacies didn't seem to notice or care about the true nature of what they were eating. Around 1 a.m., Sandra watched in horror as one passenger, a young woman who had been gorging herself on what appeared to be chocolate mousse, suddenly doubled over in agony. But instead of vomiting, something began pushing its way out of her throat. It was segmented and dark, about the size of Sandra's finger, and it wriggled free from the woman's mouth before disappearing into the shadows beneath the buffet tables. The woman stood up, wiped her mouth, and continued eating as if nothing had happened. Sandra tried to flee, but as she backed away from her hiding spot, she bumped into someone. She turned to find Chef Henri Dubois, the ship's executive chef, standing behind her with a smile that revealed teeth that were no longer entirely human. His chef's whites were stained with something dark, and his eyes had the same black, dilated appearance as the other midnight buffet patrons. "You've been watching us," he said in a voice that sounded like it was coming from underwater. "You're curious about our special ingredients, non? Perhaps you would like to try them yourself." Sandra ran. She sprinted through the corridors, took the stairs instead of the elevator, and locked herself in her cabin. But even there, she could hear them. Dozens of footsteps in the hallway, stopping at doors, trying handles. Someone knocked on her door around 3 a.m., a slow, rhythmic tapping that continued for over an hour. Through the peephole, she could see Chef Dubois standing in the corridor, holding a covered plate and smiling that terrible smile. The next morning, Sandra tried desperately to warn other passengers, but most thought she was having a breakdown. Those who might have believed her, passengers who had attended the midnight buffet, now looked at her with those same black, dilated eyes and insisted there was nothing wrong. They spoke in monotone voices and seemed to move in subtle coordination with each other, like parts of a larger organism. Dr. Martinez found Sandra in her cabin that afternoon, nearly catatonic with fear. Sandra begged the doctor to examine the midnight buffet, to test the food, to do something before more passengers were infected. But when Dr. Martinez checked her own notes, she found something that chilled her to the bone. Every patient she had treated for the strange symptoms had attended the midnight buffet multiple times. More disturbing, her blood tests showed that whatever was affecting them was spreading. The doctor decided to investigate the midnight buffet herself. She arrived early, before the passengers, and managed to collect samples of several dishes. What she found under her microscope defied medical explanation. The food was infested with parasitic organisms, unlike anything in known taxonomy. They appeared to be some kind of marine parasite, possibly picked up when the ship passed through a particularly deep part of the ocean, but they had adapted to survive in prepared food and seemed to be actively seeking human hosts. But Dr. Martinez's investigation was cut short when Chef Dubois found her in the medical lab. His transformation was now complete. His skin had taken on a grayish, scale-like texture. His fingers were longer and ended in what looked like small claws. And when he spoke, she could see that his mouth was full of needle-sharp teeth. "Doctor," he said in that underwater voice, "you shouldn't be examining our friends. They don't like to be disturbed. Why don't you join us for dinner tonight? The midnight buffet has prepared something very special." Dr. Martinez managed to escape, but not before Chef Dubois had scratched her arm with one of his transformed fingernails. Within hours, she began experiencing the same symptoms as the other patients: intense hunger, sensitivity to light, and an overwhelming urge to visit the midnight buffet. On the final night of the cruise, nearly half the ship's passengers had been affected. They gathered each night at the midnight buffet, consuming the parasitically infested food and undergoing gradual transformation into something that was no longer entirely human. During the day, they appeared normal enough to avoid suspicion, but at night, they became part of something larger and more sinister. Sandra, one of the few unaffected passengers remaining, barricaded herself in her cabin for the last 2 nights of the cruise. Through her porthole, she could see something that made her blood freeze: dark shapes moving in the water around the ship, keeping pace with the vessel. They looked organic but wrong, like massive sea creatures that had been twisted into impossible forms. She realized that the parasites hadn't originated from the ship's food supply. They had come from these things in the water, somehow making their way into the kitchen and transforming the midnight buffet into a feeding station. When the Norwegian Epic finally docked in Miami, Sandra was among the first passengers off the ship. She tried to report what had happened to the authorities, but without evidence, her story was dismissed as a cruise-induced breakdown. The ship underwent what was described as routine cleaning and maintenance, but Sandra knew better. The midnight buffet was quietly discontinued on the Norwegian Epic after that cruise, officially due to operational restructuring. But passengers on subsequent voyages reported strange occurrences in the ship's kitchens at night. Sounds of something large moving through the food preparation areas, unexplained smells coming from the walk-in freezers, and kitchen staff who worked only night shifts and were never seen during the day. Sandra never cruised again. She closed her food blog and avoided seafood restaurants, especially those that served late-night meals. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, she still woke up with an inexplicable craving for something she couldn't name, something raw, something alive, something that called to the part of her that had been touched by whatever lurked in the depths of the ocean and had found its way onto Deck 12 of the Norwegian Epic. The Celebrity Solstice was halfway through its 10-day Mediterranean cruise when passengers began experiencing what the ship's medical staff initially dismissed as unusually vivid dreams. But as the voyage continued through the calm waters between Sicily and Malta, it became horrifyingly clear that something far more sinister was happening in the depths of sleep aboard the luxury liner. It started with Emma Rodriguez, a travel writer from Chicago, who had booked a suite on Deck 10 to review the ship's amenities. On the fourth night of the cruise, she experienced what she later described as the most terrifying nightmare of her life. In the dream, she found herself walking through the ship's corridors, but they had changed. The elegant carpeting was gone, replaced by rusted metal floors that echoed with each footstep. The walls wept with condensation that smelled of decay, and the lights flickered with a sickly yellow glow that cast dancing shadows everywhere. In this nightmare version of the ship, Emma encountered other passengers, but they were wrong somehow. Their movements were too fluid, their faces slightly out of focus, and when they spoke, their voices echoed as if coming from a great distance. Most disturbing was that they all seemed to know something she didn't, sharing secretive glances and whispering in languages that sounded almost familiar, but made no sense. Emma woke from the dream drenched in sweat, her heart pounding. But what truly frightened her was that she could still smell the decay from her dream, and her feet were dirty. Not with regular dirt, but with the kind of grime that comes from walking on rusted metal. She checked her suite thoroughly, but everything was pristine and normal. The carpet was clean, the air conditioning worked perfectly, and there was no source for the metallic smell that still lingered in her nostrils. The next day, Emma mentioned her vivid dream to other passengers at breakfast, hoping to laugh it off. Instead, she discovered that several others had experienced remarkably similar nightmares. Marcus Thompson, a retired engineer from Boston, described walking through identical rusted corridors. Sarah Kim, a pediatric nurse from Seattle, talked about encountering the same strangely fluid passengers who spoke in incomprehensible languages. Most unsettling was that all of them had woken up with dirty feet and that lingering smell of decay. Dr. James Hoffman, the ship's chief medical officer, initially attributed the shared nightmare experience to suggestion and the power of storytelling. Passengers often influenced each other's dreams, especially in the closed environment of a cruise ship. But as more reports came in, he grew concerned. By the sixth day of the cruise, nearly 200 passengers had experienced variations of the same nightmare, and they were all exhibiting similar physical symptoms upon waking: dirty feet, the smell of rust and decay, and small scratches on their arms and legs that hadn't been there when they went to sleep. The dreams began evolving. Passengers reported that the nightmare ship was becoming more elaborate and detailed with each night. They found new areas that didn't exist on the real Celebrity Solstice: flooded lower decks where something large moved through the water, engine rooms filled with machinery that looked organic rather than mechanical, and dining halls where the tables were set for meals, but the food was writhing and alive. Most disturbing were the other passengers they encountered in the dream world. These figures were becoming more solid and interactive each night, as if they were gaining strength from the dreamers' visits. They would approach the sleeping passengers with urgent messages, speaking in those strange, almost familiar languages, pointing toward deeper parts of the nightmare ship that the dreamers hadn't yet explored. Rebecca Walsh, a psychology professor from Yale, became fascinated by the phenomenon and began documenting the shared dream experiences. She discovered that the dreamers weren't random. They were all staying in cabins on the port side of the ship, and they had all visited the ship's spa for deep tissue massages using a new aromatherapy oil blend that had been introduced just before the cruise. The spa staff claimed the oil was made from rare Mediterranean herbs, but when Rebecca pressed for details, their stories became vague and contradictory. On the seventh night, the dreams took a darker turn. Passengers reported that the nightmare ship's inhabitants were no longer content to simply watch and whisper. They began reaching out to touch the dreamers, their fingers leaving cold, clammy sensations that persisted after waking. Some dreamers found themselves being led deeper into the ship's bowels, into areas that pulsed with a heartbeat-like rhythm, and where the walls felt warm and organic to the touch. Thomas Anderson, a software developer from Austin, experienced the most terrifying escalation. In his dream, he was led by one of the strange passengers to what appeared to be the ship's engine room. But instead of machinery, he found a massive organic chamber filled with cocoon-like structures suspended from the ceiling. Inside these cocoons, he could see the silhouettes of human figures, all curled in fetal positions. The strange passenger pointed to an empty cocoon and spoke in that incomprehensible language. But somehow Thomas understood. They wanted him to climb inside. Thomas fought against the dream, trying to wake up, but found himself trapped in the nightmare. The strange passengers surrounded him, their faces becoming clearer, but more horrifying. They weren't quite human anymore. Their features stretched and distorted, as if they had been underwater for too long. They began pushing him toward the empty cocoon, and he could feel their cold, wet hands on his skin with perfect clarity. When Thomas finally woke up, he was standing in his cabin's shower, fully clothed and soaking wet. The water was ice cold, and he was shivering uncontrollably. His clothes smelled of seawater and that persistent odor of decay. Most terrifying of all, there were red marks on his arms, where the dream figures had grabbed him, marks that matched perfectly with where he had felt their touch in the nightmare. Dr. Hoffman finally ordered an investigation of the spa and its aromatherapy oils. What the ship's security found in the spa's storage room defied explanation. The Mediterranean herb oil wasn't made from plants at all. Under microscopic examination, it appeared to be some kind of organic secretion, possibly from a marine organism, mixed with compounds that had psychoactive properties. The oil had been delivered to the ship by a supply company that, upon investigation, didn't exist. The paperwork was forged, and the delivery had been made by people who weren't in the ship's security footage. But the investigation came too late. On the eighth night, the affected passengers didn't just have nightmares. They began sleepwalking. Security cameras captured dozens of people leaving their cabins at exactly 3 a.m., all walking in perfect synchronization toward the ship's lower decks. They moved with their eyes closed, navigating the corridors with impossible precision, avoiding obstacles and even stopping at security doors, as if they knew exactly where they were going. The sleepwalkers converged in the ship's laundry facility, deep in the bowels of the vessel. When security arrived, they found the passengers standing in formation around the industrial washing machines, which were running despite being scheduled for maintenance. The machines weren't washing clothes. They were filled with seawater that had somehow gotten into the ship's freshwater system, and floating in that water were organic masses that pulsed with their own internal light. When security tried to wake the sleepwalkers, they discovered something horrifying. The passengers' eyes were open, but they were completely white, rolled back to show only the sclera. They were breathing, but their breath came out as a fine mist that smelled of deep ocean water. Most disturbing of all, they were humming in perfect unison, a low, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate through the ship's hull. Dr. Hoffman managed to wake several of the sleepwalkers using smelling salts, but their accounts of the experience were terrifying. They described being pulled down through the ship by invisible currents, feeling as if they were drowning while still breathing air. They spoke of seeing the true nature of the vessel, Not a cruise ship at all, but something alive and ancient that had been masquerading as a luxury liner to lure passengers into its depths. Emma Rodriguez, one of the first to wake, grabbed Dr. Hoffman's arm with desperate strength. "It's not a ship," she whispered, her voice hoarse from salt water that shouldn't have been in her lungs. "It's a creature. We're not sailing on the Mediterranean. We're inside something that's been swimming in the deep ocean for centuries, and it's been feeding on us while we sleep." The remaining nights of the cruise were spent in terror. The affected passengers refused to sleep, forming groups to keep watch over each other. But exhaustion eventually overtook them, and when they did fall asleep, the nightmares returned with vengeance. Now, instead of walking through a rusted ship, they found themselves swimming through vast organic chambers filled with bioluminescent organisms that whispered secrets of the deep ocean. The worst revelation came on the final night, when the sleepwalkers were found, not in the laundry room, but standing on the ship's outer decks, staring down into the Mediterranean waters. In the moonlight, passengers could see something massive moving beneath the surface, something with the same general shape as their cruise ship, but covered in organic growths that pulsed with internal light. The thing in the water was keeping perfect pace with the celebrity solstice, as if they were somehow connected. When the ship finally docked in Barcelona, the affected passengers were quietly transferred to a private medical facility for observation and treatment. The official story was food poisoning, but those who had experienced the nightmares knew better. The ship underwent extensive renovations before its next cruise, with particular attention paid to the spa facilities and the lower decks. But the Celebrity Solstice's subsequent voyages continued to report incidents of shared nightmares, sleepwalking passengers, and mysterious organic substances found in the ship's water systems. Maritime experts noted that the ship's route often took it over some of the deepest parts of the Mediterranean, areas where the ocean floor had never been fully mapped, and where sonar readings sometimes detected massive objects that moved with the currents. Emma Rodriguez never slept soundly again. She would lie awake at night, listening to the sounds of her apartment building, afraid that she might hear that familiar humming or feel the pull of invisible currents, drawing her down into depths that existed somewhere between dreams and reality. Sometimes, in the moments just before dawn, she could swear she smelled seawater and heard the distant sound of waves against a hull that was more alive than any ship had a right to be. The Royal Princess was renowned for its spectacular Deck 15 observation lounge, a glass-enclosed space filled with polished mirrors and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the ocean. Passengers loved to gather there during sunset to watch the horizon blur into golden infinity. But during the ship's October 2019 transatlantic crossing, those same mirrors began reflecting something that shouldn't exist, and passengers who looked too long started disappearing into their own reflections. It began with Catherine Mills, a photographer from Denver, who was documenting the cruise for a travel magazine. She had positioned herself in the observation lounge early one evening to capture the sunset through the massive windows. As she adjusted her camera settings, she noticed something odd in one of the ornate mirrors that lined the lounge's walls. Her reflection was there, as expected, but it was moving independently, raising the camera to its eye, while Catherine's hands were still adjusting the lens. Catherine stepped closer to the mirror, convinced it was a trick of the lighting. But as she watched, her reflection smiled at her, while Catherine's own face remained neutral. The reflected Catherine waved with her free hand, then pointed behind the real Catherine, as if warning her about something approaching from behind. When Catherine spun around, there was nothing there. When she turned back to the mirror, her reflection had returned to normal, mimicking her movements exactly. Shaken, Catherine mentioned the incident to other passengers that evening at dinner. To her surprise, she wasn't alone in her experience. David Chen, a businessman from San Francisco, had seen his reflection in the men's restroom mirror speaking silently to him, lips moving as if having an urgent conversation. Maria Santos, a retired teacher from Miami, watched her reflection in the elevator mirrors, gesturing frantically at something outside the elevator that only the reflected Maria could apparently see. Dr. Amanda Foster, a psychiatrist traveling with her husband, initially attributed these reports to the psychological effects of being surrounded by water for days. The human mind, she explained, often played tricks in environments where visual reference points were limited. But her scientific skepticism wavered when she experienced the phenomenon herself. Late one night, Dr. Foster couldn't sleep and went to the observation lounge to read. The space was dimly lit by emergency lighting, with the mirrors creating a maze of reflected images stretching into seeming infinity. As she settled into a chair with her book, she noticed movement in her peripheral vision. In one of the mirrors, she could see her reflection reading, but the reflected Dr. Foster was reading a different book entirely, one that appeared to be bound in what looked like human skin and seemed to glow with its own pale light. The reflected Dr. Foster looked up from her grotesque book and made direct eye contact with the real Dr. Foster. The reflection's eyes were completely black, and when it smiled, its teeth appeared to have been filed into sharp points. The reflected version mouthed words that Dr. Foster could somehow understand, despite hearing no sound. "Come closer. See what you really are." Dr. Foster fled the observation lounge, but the encounter left her deeply disturbed. She began researching the ship's history and discovered something troubling. The Royal Princess had been built incorporating materials salvaged from several older vessels, including mirrors and fixtures from the ill-fated SS Morro Castle, which had burned at sea in 1934 with significant loss of life. The ship's mirrors, it seemed, had witnessed death before. The mirror incidents escalated rapidly. Passengers reported seeing their reflections, performing actions they weren't doing, writing messages on fogged bathroom mirrors, gesturing frantically for help, or simply staring back with expressions of pure terror. Most disturbing were the reflections that showed passengers in different clothing, sometimes in period dress, from decades past, as if the mirrors were displaying different versions of people from different times. Susan Walsh, a librarian from Portland, experienced the most unsettling encounter yet. While getting ready for dinner in her cabin, she noticed that her reflection in the vanity mirror was getting dressed for bed instead of for dinner. The reflected Susan was putting on a nightgown that the real Susan didn't own, a white, old-fashioned garment that looked like something from the 1930s. As she watched, her reflection began to look panicked, clawing at the nightgown as if it were on fire, mouth open in a silent scream. Susan reached out to touch the mirror, and her reflection did something that made her blood freeze. It pressed its hand against the glass from the other side, as if trying to break through. Susan could feel heat emanating from the mirror's surface, and for a moment, she swore she could smell smoke. When she pulled her hand away, there was a handprint burned into the mirror's surface, but it was on the wrong side, inside the reflection itself. The first disappearance occurred on the 7th night of the crossing. Robert Martinez, a chef from Los Angeles, was last seen in the observation lounge around midnight, staring intently into one of the large mirrors. Security footage showed him approaching the mirror, placing his hand against the glass, then simply vanishing. The camera captured his reflection remaining in the mirror for several seconds after Robert himself had disappeared, looking around frantically before it too faded away. A thorough search of the ship revealed no trace of Robert. His cabin showed no signs of struggle, His belongings were untouched, and there was no way he could have gone overboard from the enclosed observation lounge. The only clue was that the mirror he had been staring into was now cracked in a spiderweb pattern, and the glass was warm to the touch, despite the air conditioning. Panic spread among the passengers as news of Robert's disappearance circulated. Many began avoiding mirrors altogether, covering the ones in their cabins with towels, or avoiding areas of the ship with reflective surfaces. But the mirrors seemed to be calling to certain passengers, drawing them despite their fear. Margaret Thompson, a nurse from Chicago, found herself inexplicably drawn to the observation lounge night after night. She would stand before the mirrors, transfixed by what she saw in the reflections. Her reflected self appeared younger, healthier, free from the arthritis that plagued her real body. The reflection seemed to be living in a brighter, better version of the ship, where the food was more elegant, the decor more luxurious, and other passengers appeared happy and vibrant rather than fearful. "It's showing me what could be," Margaret told Dr. Foster during an impromptu counseling session. "My reflection looks so much better than I do. She's in a better place than this ship. Sometimes I think about reaching through the glass and trading places with her." Dr. Foster warned Margaret to stay away from the mirrors, but it was too late. That night, Margaret was found standing in the observation lounge, her hand pressed against a mirror, just as Robert's had been. Security rushed to stop her, but as they approached, Margaret began to sink into the mirror's surface, as if it were made of liquid mercury. Her reflection, meanwhile, pressed forward from the other side, trying to step out into the real world. The security guards grabbed Margaret's arms and pulled, but it felt like trying to extract someone from quicksand. As they struggled, they could see Margaret's reflection becoming more solid, while the real Margaret became increasingly translucent. For a terrifying moment, both versions existed simultaneously, one being pulled back into reality, one trying to escape from the mirror world. The guards managed to pull Margaret back, but the woman they rescued wasn't entirely the same person who had approached the mirror. Margaret's eyes now held flecks of silver that reflected light like a mirror's surface, and she spoke in a voice that seemed to echo as if coming from a great distance. She claimed to remember being in a beautiful version of the ship, where everyone was happy and the sun always shone through windows that showed peaceful harbors instead of endless ocean. The ship's captain, William Morrison, made the decision to cover all mirrors on Deck 15 and restrict passenger access to the observation lounge. But the mirror's influence had spread beyond their physical location. Passengers reported seeing the strange reflections in any reflective surface, windows, phone screens, even puddles of water on deck. The mirror world seemed to be overlapping more and more with the real ship. The most terrifying incident occurred when the ship's hairstylist, Janet Kim, was working in the salon surrounded by professional mirrors. During a routine haircut, both Janet and her client, Patricia Wong, noticed that their reflections were performing the same actions, but with different results. The reflected Janet appeared to be cutting Patricia's throat instead of her hair, while the reflected Patricia sat calmly as blood poured down her neck. Both women screamed and stepped away from the mirrors, but the reflections continued their gruesome pantomime. The reflected Janet held up bloodied scissors and pointed at the real Janet, then at the mirror, as if inviting her to step through and complete the act she was only performing in the reflection. Meanwhile, the reflected Patricia collapsed in her chair, blood pooling around the salon chair in the mirror world, while the real Patricia stood unharmed but terrified. Dr. Foster, working with the ship's engineering staff, discovered that all the affected mirrors had been installed using a special silver backing that contained materials from the original S.E. Morro Castle mirrors. The salvaged silver had been mixed with new materials, But somehow the old mirror's properties, their ability to hold on to images and experiences, had contaminated the new ones. On the final night of the crossing, passengers reported that the mirror world was becoming more real, while their actual ship seemed to be fading. The reflections were no longer confined to mirrors. They could be seen moving through the ship's corridors as translucent figures, living out scenes from what appeared to be the Morro Castle's final voyage. Passengers watched in horror as reflected figures ran through the halls, clothes on fire, fleeing from smoke that only existed in the mirror world. The boundary between the reflection and reality grew thinner with each passing hour. Some passengers began to see double, unsure which version of events was real: the calm cruise ship they thought they were on, or the burning vessel their reflections seemed to inhabit. A few more passengers vanished entirely, stepping into mirrors that showed them escape routes from fires that didn't exist in the real world. When the Royal Princess finally docked in Southampton, the crew quietly removed all mirrors containing the contaminated silver backing. The missing passengers were never found, though some crew members reported seeing familiar faces in new mirrors, installed months later, silently mouthing pleas for help from within the glass. The salvaged materials from the SS Morro Castle were disposed of at sea, but maritime records show that other ships have since reported similar incidents. Passengers becoming obsessed with their reflections and occasionally disappearing into mirrors that seem to offer glimpses of better, brighter worlds that exist only on the other side of the glass. Dr. Foster never traveled by cruise ship again, and she covered all mirrors in her home with heavy cloth. Sometimes, in the corner of her eye, she would catch sight of her reflection moving independently in darkened windows, still trapped somewhere between the world of the living and the silver-backed realm, where the dead continue to sail forever through burning seas. The allure of the seas was 3 days into its 7-night Caribbean voyage when Chief Engineer Marcus Volkov first noticed that the ship's massive diesel engines had developed a rhythm that sounded disturbingly organic. What began as a subtle change in the mechanical heartbeat that drove the 225,000-ton vessel would evolve into something that challenged everything the crew understood about the boundary between machine and living flesh. Marcus had worked on cruise ships for over 20 years, and he knew every sound his engines should make: the steady thrum of pistons, the whoosh of air intake systems, the rhythmic pulse of fuel injection. But on that third morning, as he made his routine inspection of the engine room, he heard something that made him stop dead in his tracks. Beneath the familiar mechanical symphony was a new sound, a slow, wet thumping that reminded him uncomfortably of a human heartbeat magnified 1,000 times. At first, Marcus attributed the sound to a minor mechanical issue, perhaps a loose mounting bracket or a slight misalignment in one of the massive rotating assemblies. But as he moved through the engine room with his diagnostic equipment, he couldn't locate the source of the rhythmic thumping. The sound seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, as if the entire engine room had developed a pulse. During his inspection, Marcus noticed other disturbing changes. The metal surfaces throughout the engine room felt warmer than usual, not from mechanical heat, but from something else, a warmth that seemed organic, like touching living skin. When he pressed his hand against one of the main engine housings, he could swear he felt it give slightly under pressure, as if there were something soft and yielding beneath the steel casing. The ship's vibration patterns had changed as well. Instead of the steady, predictable oscillations of mechanical operation, the allure of the seas was now moving through the water with a subtle undulating motion, like a massive sea creature swimming, rather than a vessel being pushed by propellers. Passengers on the upper decks began complaining of motion sickness despite calm seas, and several crew members reported feeling disoriented while walking through the ship's corridors. Dr. Sarah Chen, the ship's chief medical officer, was called to examine Marcus when he reported feeling nauseated and experiencing strange sensations during his engine room duties. What she found during his examination was deeply concerning. Marcus's heart rate had synchronized with the new rhythm coming from the engines, beating in perfect time with the wet thumping that now dominated the lower decks. "It's like the ship is trying to match my heartbeat," Marcus told Dr. Chen, his voice shaking. "But I think it's the other way around. I think my heart is matching the ship's. When I'm down in the engine room, I can feel it pulling at my chest, trying to get my pulse to line up with whatever is making that sound." Dr. Chen decided to investigate the engine room herself, despite Marcus's warnings about the strange effects the space was having on him. What she found defied medical explanation. The engine room's atmosphere had changed. The air itself seemed thicker, more humid, with a metallic taste that reminded her of blood. The temperature readings on her instruments showed normal levels, but her body felt like she was in a tropical greenhouse. As Dr. Chen moved deeper into the engine room, she began to notice that the massive engines themselves appeared to be changing. The steel surfaces had developed a subtle sheen that looked almost like perspiration, and in several places, she could see what appeared to be veins, dark branching lines that pulsed with the same rhythm as the mysterious heartbeat. When she touched one of these lines with her finger, it was warm and seemed to throb with internal pressure. The most disturbing discovery came when Dr. Chen used her stethoscope to listen to the engine housings. Instead of the mechanical sounds she expected, she heard what could only be described as breathing. Slow, deep inhalations and exhalations that seemed to come from within the metal itself. Between the breathing sounds, she could hear liquid flowing through what sounded like a vast circulatory system, as if the engines had developed arteries and veins. Engine room personnel began reporting increasingly strange experiences during their shifts. Tommy Rodriguez, a junior engineer from Tampa, claimed that the engine controls were becoming more responsive, almost anticipating his commands before he could input them. "It's like the ship knows what I want it to do before I do," he told his supervisor. "Sometimes I reach for a control, and it's already adjusting itself." Other crew members reported that the engine room was developing new spaces, corridors and chambers that didn't appear on any blueprint. These organic-looking passages seemed to grow from the walls themselves, their surfaces smooth and warm, like the inside of a living creature. Crew members who explored these new areas described feeling like they were walking through the digestive system of some massive organism. The ship's electrical systems began behaving erratically as well, but in ways that suggested intelligence rather than malfunction. Lights would dim and brighten in waves that matched the heartbeat rhythm. Elevators would change floors on their own to deliver passengers where they needed to go before they had pressed any buttons. And the ship's public address system occasionally transmitted sounds that resembled breathing or sighing. Captain Elena Morrison ordered a full inspection of the engine room by external marine engineers when the ship docked in Cozumel, but the inspection team found nothing mechanically wrong with the vessel. According to their instruments, all systems were operating within normal parameters. However, several inspectors reported feeling uncomfortable in the engine room, describing sensations of being watched and an overwhelming urge to place their hands on the warm metal surfaces. Dr. Chen made a disturbing discovery while reviewing the ship's construction records. The Allure of the Seas had been built using a new type of steel alloy that incorporated recycled materials from multiple sources, including medical equipment from decommissioned hospitals and research facilities. Some of these materials had come from a cardiac research laboratory that had been studying artificial heart technology before being shut down due to ethical violations in their experimental procedures. The research facility, Dr. Chen learned, had been developing artificial hearts using a combination of mechanical components and bioengineered tissues. Their goal was to create organs that could adapt and grow with their recipients, essentially becoming living parts of the human body. The project had been terminated when several test subjects began exhibiting signs that their artificial hearts were influencing their behavior, making them increasingly aggressive and predatory. As this information came to light, the crew began to understand the horrifying truth about their vessel. The recycled medical equipment had somehow retained biological properties, and the ship's massive engines were providing the energy needed to sustain something that was part machine and part living tissue. The allure of the seas was developing its own circulatory system, its own heartbeat, and its own primitive form of consciousness. The situation escalated dramatically on the 6th night of the cruise when passengers began experiencing physical symptoms similar to those affecting the engine room crew. Many complained of their heartbeats becoming irregular, as if something was trying to force them into synchronization with the ship's pulse. Some passengers reported feeling compelled to visit the lower decks, drawn by an overwhelming urge to get closer to the source of the heartbeat. Maria Santos, a nurse from Miami, followed this compulsion and found herself in areas of the ship she had never seen before, organic-looking corridors that seemed to pulse with their own internal light. The walls were warm and slightly soft to the touch, and she could hear what sounded like breathing echoing through the passages. As she moved deeper into these new areas, she began to feel that she was walking through the interior of a living creature. At the center of these organic passages, Maria discovered what could only be described as the ship's heart, a massive, beating organ that seemed to be made of both metal and flesh. It was connected to the engine room above by thick, vein-like tubes that pulsed with dark fluid, and its rhythm was perfectly synchronized with the sounds that had been emanating from the engines. The heart was easily the size of a small room, and its surface was covered with what looked like sensory organs, clusters of eyes and nerve endings that tracked Maria's movement as she approached. When Maria reached out to touch the heart, it responded by beating faster, and she felt an overwhelming surge of connection to the ship itself. She could sense the vessel's primitive consciousness, its hunger for the life energy of its passengers, and its growing desire to transform from a mere transport vessel into something truly alive. The heart was using the passengers' proximity to grow stronger, feeding on their bioelectric energy and slowly incorporating their life force into its own developing consciousness. Maria managed to escape from the organic corridors, but she was forever changed by the encounter. Her own heartbeat remained synchronized with the ship's pulse even after she left the vessel, and she reported feeling a constant urge to return to the sea. Medical examinations revealed that her cardiovascular system had been subtly altered, with new neural pathways that seemed to respond to electromagnetic signals from large metal structures. The final night of the cruise brought the most terrifying revelation. Passengers throughout the ship began sleepwalking, all moving in the same direction toward the lower decks. They moved in perfect synchronization, their footsteps matching the rhythm of the ship's heartbeat. Security footage showed hundreds of people walking through the corridors like blood cells, flowing through arteries, all drawn toward the organic heart that was now pumping not just for itself, but for every living person aboard the vessel. When the allure of the seas finally docked in Fort Lauderdale, the ship's heart had grown strong enough to exert influence over nearby vessels. Other ships in the harbor reported electrical malfunctions and strange behavioral changes among their crews. The Coast Guard quietly quarantined the vessel, claiming mechanical difficulties. But maritime engineers who examined the ship found that many of its systems had become partially organic, with metal components showing signs of cellular growth and biological adaptation. The ship was eventually decommissioned and scrapped, but crew members from the salvage operation reported that the heart continued beating even after the engines were removed. The organic components had to be destroyed through incineration, but even then, witnesses claimed they could hear a faint pulse coming from the ashes. The recycled steel from the Allure of the Seas was banned from use in future construction projects, but rumors persist that some materials found their way into other vessels. Marcus Volkov never worked on another ship. His heart remained synchronized with electromagnetic frequencies similar to those generated by large marine engines, and he was forced to live far from any major ports to avoid the physical distress caused by proximity to vessels that reminded his cardiovascular system of its time aboard the living ship. Sometimes, late at night, he would wake to the sound of his own heartbeat, matching a rhythm that seemed to call from somewhere far out at sea. The Celebrity Eclipse was scheduled for a simple 5-day cruise from Miami to the Western Caribbean, but passengers aboard the October 2021 voyage would soon discover that time itself had become their greatest enemy. What began as minor confusion about schedules and mealtimes would evolve into a waking nightmare, where minutes stretched into hours, days repeated themselves, and some passengers began aging decades, while others remained frozen in temporal loops that defied all logic. It started with Jennifer Walsh, a travel blogger from Chicago, who noticed that her phone's clock had stopped working on the second day of the cruise. At first, she assumed it was a simple technical glitch. Cruise ships often had issues with cellular signals and GPS synchronization. But when she asked other passengers for the time, she discovered something deeply unsettling. Everyone's timepieces showed different readings, and none of them seemed to be advancing normally. Jennifer's phone showed 2:17 p.m. and hadn't changed in over 3 hours of real-time observation. The passenger next to her at the pool bar, David Martinez from Phoenix, had a watch reading 11:42 a.m. that had been stuck on that time since the previous evening. Most disturbing was elderly passenger Ruth Henderson from Seattle, whose antique pocket watch was running backwards, its hands moving counterclockwise while she aged visibly before Jennifer's eyes. The ship's daily newsletter, normally printed with the current date and schedule, began showing contradictory information. Some copies displayed the correct cruise day, others showed dates from weeks in the future, and a few passengers received newsletters dated from decades in the past, advertising entertainment acts and menu items that hadn't existed for years. When passengers brought these discrepancies to the guest services desk, the staff appeared confused and claimed that all newsletters showed the correct date, but each staff member pointed to different dates when asked to verify. Dr. Michael Torres, the ship's physician, first became aware of the temporal anomalies when patients began arriving at the medical center with impossible medical conditions. Ruth Henderson, the elderly woman with the backwards watch, was aging at an accelerated rate. Her arthritis worsened by decades in a matter of hours. Her vision deteriorated rapidly, and her hair turned completely white and began falling out. Yet, her vital signs remained stable, as if her body was simultaneously experiencing rapid aging and perfect health. Conversely, Dr. Torres examined Tommy Rodriguez, a 12-year-old boy from Miami, who seemed to be aging in reverse. Over the course of what should have been 8 hours, Tommy's physical development regressed to that of a 9-year-old, then a 7-year-old. His parents, Maria and Carlos Rodriguez, watched in horror as their son's vocabulary became more childlike. His motor skills diminished, and his memories of recent events began to fade. Yet, Tommy remained cheerful and unaware of his condition, playing with toys that seemed to materialize from nowhere. The ship's captain, William Morrison, attempted to contact the Coast Guard when passengers began reporting that mealtimes were occurring at impossible intervals. The breakfast buffet would open, serve hundreds of passengers, then somehow reset itself moments later as if no one had eaten. Passengers would finish elaborate dinners only to discover they were still hungry and their plates were full again. Some passengers reported eating the same meal repeatedly for what felt like days, while others claimed they hadn't been able to find food service for hours despite walking past active dining areas. Navigation became equally problematic. According to the ship's GPS systems, the Celebrity Eclipse was simultaneously approaching multiple destinations. The instruments showed the vessel nearing Cozumel, Jamaica, and Key West all at the same time, while the view from the decks showed an endless expanse of ocean with no land in sight. Most unsettling was that the sun's position in the sky no longer corresponded to any logical time progression. Passengers watched it rise and set multiple times in what should have been a single hour, while other periods of apparent daylight lasted for what felt like entire days. Sarah Kim, a marine biologist from San Francisco, noticed that the ocean itself seemed to be affected by the temporal distortions. Schools of fish swam around the ship in perfect loops, following the exact same patterns repeatedly as if they were trapped in their own time cycles. The waves moved in stuttering, unnatural rhythms, sometimes flowing normally, sometimes appearing to freeze mid-motion, sometimes reversing direction entirely. She documented these phenomena with her underwater camera, but when she reviewed the footage, it showed the same 10-second loop of fish, swimming repeated hundreds of times. The ship's entertainment staff struggled to maintain normal programming as the temporal anomalies intensified. Dance classes would begin with passengers at beginner level, progress through advanced techniques, then suddenly reset with the same passengers again acting as if they had never danced before. Magic shows became genuinely supernatural events when the performers found themselves repeating the same tricks, while audiences experienced different reveals each time. The same card trick would produce different cards for different viewers, despite everyone watching the identical performance. Most disturbing were the passenger interactions that began occurring across different time streams. Elizabeth Foster, a retired teacher from Portland, reported having conversations with her deceased husband, Harold, who appeared to be experiencing the cruise as if it were their 1987 honeymoon. Harold was visible to Elizabeth and spoke about events from decades past as if they were happening in the present, but other passengers couldn't see or hear him. When Elizabeth tried to introduce Harold to other passengers, they saw only an elderly woman speaking to empty air. The ship's photographer, Marcus Chen, discovered that his cameras were capturing impossible images. Group photos would show the same people at different ages simultaneously, children appearing as adults, and elderly passengers as teenagers, all in the same frame. Wedding photos from the ship's chapel showed couples who were simultaneously young newlyweds and elderly anniversary celebrants. When Marcus developed photos in the ship's darkroom, the images would sometimes change while he watched, showing different moments from the same event that hadn't happened yet or had occurred decades ago. Dr. Torres made a terrifying discovery when he examined the ship's medical records. According to the logs, he had been treating the same patients for impossible lengths of time. Ruth Henderson's file showed 40 years of daily treatments for her accelerated aging, while Tommy Rodriguez had hundreds of entries documenting his reverse aging process. Most unsettling was his own signature on documents. Handwriting samples showed his penmanship aging and changing style over what appeared to be decades of entries, all supposedly made during the 5-day cruise. The temporal distortions reached their peak on what should have been the final day of the cruise. Passengers found themselves experiencing multiple versions of the same day simultaneously. Jennifer Walsh watched herself having breakfast in the main dining room, while simultaneously observing herself sleeping in her cabin and participating in a poolside trivia contest. Each version of herself was aware of the others, but couldn't interact with them directly, creating a nightmarish situation where she was trapped watching multiple timelines of her own experience unfold in parallel. Some passengers became lost in temporal loops that lasted subjective weeks or months. Robert Stevens, a businessman from Dallas, found himself trapped in a single conversation with his wife that repeated endlessly. The same words, the same gestures, the same emotional responses, playing out like a broken record, while he remained fully conscious of the repetition, but unable to change anything. He experienced this single 10-minute conversation hundreds of times, aging years in the process, while his wife remained frozen in the same moment. The ship's crew began experiencing their own temporal anomalies. Waitstaff would serve the same table repeatedly without memory of previous service. Cabin stewards would clean the same rooms in infinite loops, and bridge officers would make the same navigational adjustments over and over, while the ship remained in exactly the same position. Captain Morrison found himself giving the same safety briefing to passengers who were simultaneously first-time cruisers and veteran travelers who had heard his speech countless times. Jennifer Walsh made the most horrifying discovery when she managed to access the ship's computers during a brief moment of temporal clarity. The Celebrity Eclipse's internal systems showed that the cruise had been ongoing for not 5 days, but over 3 years of ship time. The passenger manifest listed people who had supposedly been aboard for decades, with some showing birth and death dates that spanned entire lifetimes spent on the vessel. According to the ship's records, generations of families had been born, lived, and died aboard the Celebrity Eclipse while experiencing what they believed was a simple 5-day vacation. The revelation came when Jennifer found the ship's original construction documents. The Celebrity Eclipse had been built using steel salvaged from the SS Kronos, a research vessel that had disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle in 1956 while conducting experiments on time dilation and temporal mechanics. The research team aboard the Kronos had been attempting to create localized time fields for theoretical physics studies, but their experiment had gone catastrophically wrong, trapping the vessel in a temporal anomaly that persisted even after the ship was broken up for scrap. The contaminated steel had carried the temporal distortion into the Celebrity Eclipse, creating a floating pocket of unstable time that trapped anyone who spent too long aboard the vessel. The cruise line was unaware of the problem because, from the outside world's perspective, the ships always returned to port on schedule. But the passengers and crew experienced subjective time that could stretch for years or compress into moments, creating a hellish existence where time itself became their prison. On what everyone hoped would be the final day, some passengers found themselves rapidly aging through entire lifetimes in minutes, while others became frozen in single moments that stretched for subjective decades. Jennifer watched in horror as David Martinez, the man with the broken watch, experienced his entire future life in fast forward. She saw him age, marry, have children, grow old, and die, all while standing next to the pool bar. When the vision ended, David was gone, leaving only a small pile of ash and his still broken watch. When the Celebrity Eclipse finally docked in Miami, according to the Port Authority, exactly on schedule, most passengers had no memory of the temporal anomalies. They disembarked believing they had enjoyed a normal 5-day cruise, but some retained fragmented memories of impossible experiences, conversations with deceased relatives, meals that lasted for days, and dreams where they lived entire lifetimes in a single night's sleep. Jennifer Walsh retained complete memories of the temporal nightmare. But when she tried to document her experiences, she discovered that her own timeline had been irrevocably altered. Her driver's license showed a birth date that was 20 years earlier than she remembered. Her apartment was filled with belongings from a life she had never lived, and her family photos showed decades of history that had occurred during what she experienced as a 5-day cruise. The celebrity eclipse continued its regular cruise schedule, but maritime records show increasing reports of passengers experiencing jet lag that lasted for months after their voyages, and an unusually high number of guests who claimed to have aged significantly during their brief vacations. The ship's employee turnover became extraordinarily high, with crew members often leaving after single contracts, claiming they felt they had worked aboard the vessel for years rather than months. Jennifer never cruised again, but she couldn't escape the temporal effects entirely. Her clocks ran backwards for hours at a time. She would occasionally experience conversations with future versions of herself, and sometimes she would wake up believing decades had passed during a single night's sleep. She lived in constant fear that she was still aboard the celebrity eclipse, trapped in one final temporal loop where she only thought she had escaped to dry land. The Norwegian breakaway was 4 days into its 7-night Bahamas cruise when passengers began noticing that their fellow travelers were disappearing, not all at once, but gradually, one piece at a time. What started as minor observations about people looking thinner or seeming smaller would evolve into a horrifying realization that something aboard the massive vessel was slowly consuming the passengers from within, digesting them so subtly that even the victims didn't realize they were being eaten alive. It began with Margaret Chen, a food critic from San Francisco, who prided herself on her attention to detail. On the 4th morning of the cruise, she noticed that her breakfast companion, Robert Walsh from Detroit, seemed different somehow. Robert was a large man, easily 250 pounds, but as they shared their meal in the ship's main dining room, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that he looked smaller than he had the day before. Not just thinner, but actually reduced in physical size, as if someone had taken a few inches off his height and breadth. When Margaret mentioned this observation to Robert, he laughed it off, claiming he felt great and had actually been eating more than usual during the cruise. But as Margaret studied him throughout their conversation, she noticed other subtle changes. Robert's clothes fit differently. His shirt was looser around the collar. His wedding ring seemed to slide more freely on his finger. And when he stood up from the table, his pants appeared to be slightly too long for his legs. Dr. Patricia Santos, the ship's physician, initially dismissed Margaret's concerns when she brought them to the medical center. People often lost weight during vacations due to increased activity and different eating schedules. But Dr. Santos became more concerned when she reviewed her patient files and discovered a disturbing pattern. Over the past 4 days, she had seen dozens of passengers complaining of feeling hollow or empty, despite eating regularly. Many described sensations of something moving inside their stomachs, not painful but unsettling, like gentle waves or currents flowing through their digestive systems. The first definitive proof of something wrong came when Linda Rodriguez, a nurse from Miami, took daily photos of herself during the cruise for social media. When she reviewed the images on her phone, she was horrified to see the progression of her own diminishment. In her day 1 photo, she appeared normal and healthy. By day 3, she looked noticeably smaller, and by day 4, she appeared to have lost at least 20 pounds and several inches of height. But Linda felt fine. Better than fine, actually. She felt light, energetic, and strangely euphoric, as if something wonderful was happening to her body. The ship's security cameras captured footage that the crew initially attributed to equipment malfunction. Passengers would enter elevators at normal size but emerge noticeably smaller. People would walk down corridors appearing to shrink with each step, their clothing becoming progressively looser as they moved. Most disturbing was the dining room footage, which showed passengers gradually diminishing in size while they ate, as if the act of consuming food was somehow causing them to be consumed in return. Chef Henri Dubois, the ship's executive chef, made a terrible discovery in the ship's food storage areas. The refrigerated compartments that should have contained thousands of pounds of meat, vegetables, and other provisions were nearly empty, despite the fact that food service had been normal throughout the cruise. When he checked the inventory logs, they showed that all supplies were accounted for and properly stocked. But the physical reality was undeniable. The food storage areas contained only a small fraction of what should have been there. More disturbing was what Henri found in place of the missing food. Throughout the storage areas, he discovered a network of organic tubes that looked disturbingly like digestive organs. Thick, fleshy conduits that pulsed with peristaltic waves and were filled with a brownish fluid that smelled like partially digested food. These tubes connected the storage areas to the ship's main structural supports, as if the vessel itself had developed a digestive system and was processing the missing provisions. Passengers began reporting increasingly disturbing sensations during meals. Many described feeling as if they were being eaten while they ate, experiencing waves of pleasure that felt wrong somehow. Some claimed they could feel their food being absorbed before it reached their stomachs, as if something in their throats was pre-digesting their meals. Others reported that their saliva had changed consistency, becoming thicker and more acidic, with a strange ability to break down food almost instantly upon contact. The ship's medical staff discovered that passengers' digestive systems were undergoing rapid physiological changes. X-rays revealed that many passengers had developed additional stomach chambers, like those found in ruminants, and their intestinal tracts had elongated dramatically, while somehow fitting into their shrinking body cavities. Blood tests showed elevated levels of digestive enzymes that didn't normally exist in human biology, and several passengers had developed secondary esophagi that seemed to be transporting nutrients directly to unknown destinations within their bodies. Margaret Chen made the most horrifying discovery when she decided to investigate the ship's lower decks. Following the organic tubes that Henri had found in the food storage areas, she descended into maintenance areas that didn't appear on any ship blueprint. These spaces were warm and humid, with walls that were undeniably alive. They pulsed with a slow rhythm and were covered in what looked like stomach lining, complete with villi that waved gently in the humid air. At the center of these organic chambers, Margaret found what could only be described as the ship's digestive core, a massive stomach-like cavity that was processing something that looked disturbingly familiar. Floating in the acidic digestive fluids were partially dissolved items of clothing, jewelry, and personal belongings that she recognized as belonging to passengers who had been gradually shrinking throughout the cruise. But most horrifying was the realization that these weren't just the passengers' possessions being digested. Mixed in with the clothing were partially dissolved body parts that were clearly human in origin. The passengers weren't just shrinking, they were being slowly digested alive, their bodies broken down and absorbed so gradually that they remained conscious and functional, even as they were being consumed. The euphoric feelings they experienced were the result of digestive enzymes that kept them calm and cooperative during the process, while their shrinking bodies were actually being dissolved from the inside out and replaced with a substance that maintained their basic functions while providing nutrients to whatever the ship had become. Margaret tried to flee the digestive chambers, but found that her own body had been affected by prolonged exposure to the ship's digestive environment. Her skin had become partially permeable, allowing the ship's enzymes to slowly break down her cellular structure. She could feel herself becoming lighter and smaller with each passing minute, but the sensation was accompanied by waves of pleasure that made it difficult to feel alarmed about her condition. When Margaret finally reached the upper decks, she discovered that the other passengers were further along in the digestion process than she had realized. Many were now only half their original size, but seemed completely unaware of their condition. They continued eating enthusiastically, not realizing that they were feeding the very organism that was consuming them. Their conversations had become simpler and more repetitive, as if their brain functions were being affected by the digestive process. Dr. Santos attempted to treat the affected passengers, but found that reversing their condition was impossible. The digestive process had integrated so thoroughly with their biological systems that stopping it would kill them. The passengers had become part of the ship's digestive cycle, serving as both food source and processing organs for whatever the vessel had become. They were conscious and seemingly happy, but they were no longer entirely human. The ship's captain, William Morrison, discovered that the Norwegian Breakaway's navigation systems were no longer under human control. The vessel was following currents and routes that would take it to deep ocean areas where it could continue its feeding process without interference. The ship had become a massive predatory organism that used the luxury cruise experience as bait to lure in food sources that would sustain it during long oceanic migrations. The most terrifying revelation came when the crew realized that this wasn't the ship's first feeding cruise. Records showed that the Norwegian Breakaway had been making these voyages for years, taking on thousands of passengers who were gradually consumed during seemingly normal vacation cruises. The passengers who returned to port were not the same people who had boarded. They were biological constructs created by the ship to maintain the illusion of a successful cruise, while the original passengers had been completely digested and absorbed into the ship's growing mass. On the final day of the cruise, Margaret watched in horror as the remaining passengers continued to shrink and become more integrated into the ship's digestive systems. Some had become so small that they could fit through the organic tubes, flowing through the ship's digestive network like nutrients in a bloodstream. Others had developed gills and lived in the acidic digestive pools, breathing the corrosive fluids as if they were water. When the Norwegian Breakaway docked in Miami, the passengers who disembarked appeared normal to outside observers, but Margaret could see the truth. These weren't the original passengers. They were biological replicas created by the ship to maintain its camouflage. The real passengers had been completely consumed, their consciousness absorbed into the ship's growing intelligence, while their bodies provided nutrients for its continued existence. Margaret herself had been partially digested and reconstructed, leaving her with memories of the original cruise, but uncertainty about whether her experiences were real or artificially implanted. She retained enough of her original consciousness to remember the horror, but her body was now partially dependent on the ship's digestive enzymes. She was compelled to book another cruise within months, knowing that she would continue to be consumed until nothing of her original self remained. The Norwegian Breakaway continued its cruise schedule, taking on new passengers for each voyage, while slowly processing them through its digestive cycles. Maritime authorities never investigated because, from their perspective, all cruises completed successfully with satisfied passengers. They had no way of knowing that each voyage was actually a feeding cycle for a massive predatory organism that had learned to use human hospitality as the perfect hunting strategy. Margaret never fully escaped her partial digestion. She lived in constant awareness that part of her had been absorbed into something vast and hungry that swam through the world's oceans, using luxury cruise ships as mobile feeding stations. Sometimes, late at night, she could feel the ship calling to her through the biological connection it had established, inviting her to return and complete the process of becoming one with its endless, patient hunger. The Harmony of the Seas was renowned for its state-of-the-art audio systems and soundproofed entertainment venues. But passengers on the November 2022 Mediterranean cruise would discover that the ship's relationship with sound had evolved into something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. What began as minor acoustic anomalies would escalate into a nightmare, where sound itself became a predatory force that fed on human voices and left its victims trapped in an ever-expanding realm of absolute silence. It started with Jessica Morrison, a music teacher from Nashville, who had booked the cruise specifically to experience the ship's acclaimed concert venues. On the second night, while attending a piano recital in the ship's main theater, Jessica noticed that certain notes seemed to linger in the air longer than physically possible. The pianist would finish a phrase, but individual notes continued to resonate and echo, creating harmonies that weren't being played. Even stranger, these phantom notes seemed to move through the theater, drifting from seat to seat like invisible musical entities. After the performance, Jessica approached the pianist, David Chen, a classical musician from Boston, to discuss what she had heard. David's response was deeply unsettling. "You heard them too?" he whispered, glancing around nervously. "The notes that don't want to die? They've been following me since the first night. Sometimes I'll play a simple melody, but the piano keeps playing new notes after I lift my fingers. It's like the music wants to continue itself." Dr. Amanda Foster, an audiologist from Denver who was traveling with her family, became interested in the acoustic phenomena when her young daughter Emma began speaking to what she called sound friends. Emma claimed that whispers followed her around the ship, carrying on conversations with her in languages she didn't recognize. When Dr. Foster listened carefully, she could indeed hear faint voices seeming to emanate from the walls themselves, speaking in overlapping whispers that created an incomprehensible chorus. The ship's audio engineer, Marcus Rodriguez, was called to investigate when passengers began complaining about their voices behaving strangely. Some reported that their words would echo back to them minutes or even hours after speaking, while others found that certain syllables would simply disappear from their speech, leaving gaps in their sentences that others couldn't hear. Most disturbing were passengers who claimed they could hear conversations they had never had, featuring their own voices discussing topics they had no memory of. Marcus discovered that the ship's sound system had developed anomalies that defied acoustic principles. Audio equipment throughout the vessel was recording and playing back sounds that had never been input into the system. Microphones were picking up conversations from empty rooms. Speakers were emitting voices of passengers who were miles away. And the ship's PA system occasionally broadcast what sounded like announcements from decades in the past, delivered in the voices of crew members who had never worked aboard the Harmony of the Seas. The first sign of something genuinely dangerous came when passenger Robert Walsh, a construction worker from Chicago, began losing his voice in an unprecedented way. During dinner conversation, Robert's words became progressively fainter, not from throat problems, but as if his voice was being drained away by something unseen. His family watched in horror as Robert's mouth moved normally, but the sounds that emerged grew weaker and more distant with each sentence, until he was speaking in what could only be described as a whisper from miles away. Dr. Helen Santos, the ship's physician, examined Robert and found his vocal cords and respiratory system were perfectly healthy. Yet his voice continued to fade until it became completely inaudible, even though his mouth and throat still moved with normal speech patterns. When Dr. Santos used amplification equipment to try to boost Robert's voice, the microphones picked up nothing. It was as if his voice was being absorbed by something that left no trace of sound behind. The acoustic anomalies escalated when passengers began reporting that sounds were becoming visible. Maria Chen, a graphic designer from Los Angeles, watched in fascination and terror as conversations in the ship's main dining room manifested as translucent flowing shapes that moved through the air like smoke. Laughter appeared as bright dancing lights, while arguments took the form of dark angular shadows that seemed to cut through the atmosphere with razor-sharp edges. These visible sounds weren't merely hallucinations. Multiple passengers could see the same acoustic manifestations, and more disturbing still, these sound shapes began to interact with the physical world. Musical notes from the ship's evening entertainment became solid enough to perch on railings like strange birds, while conversations formed flowing streams of light that passengers could almost touch. Most unnervingly, these visible sounds seemed to be aware of human observers, changing direction and intensity when people looked at them directly. The ship's librarian, Thomas Anderson, made a crucial discovery when he found that certain areas of the vessel had become completely silent, not just quiet, but completely devoid of any acoustic properties. These dead zones, primarily located on Deck 7, absorbed all sound that entered them. Passengers who walked into these areas found their footsteps, breathing, and heartbeats simply vanishing into nothingness. Even dropping metal objects produced no sound whatsoever. Within these silent zones, Thomas discovered something that challenged his understanding of reality. The absorbed sounds hadn't disappeared. They had accumulated into living acoustic entities that existed in a realm parallel to normal space. Through the ship's windows, when viewed from within the silent areas, Thomas could see a version of the ocean filled with swimming sounds, whale songs that had taken physical form, ship engines that moved like mechanical sea creatures, and human voices that schooled together like luminous fish. Dr. Foster realized that the ship's advanced acoustic engineering had created an environment where sound could achieve a form of independent existence. The vessel's sophisticated noise cancellation systems, designed to create perfect acoustic environments for entertainment, had instead created a barrier between the world of normal sound and a realm where acoustic energy could accumulate and evolve. The ship had become a nursery for sound-based life forms that fed on human vocal energy. The situation became critical when passengers who spent too much time in areas with heavy acoustic activity began to lose their ability to produce sound permanently. Robert Walsh was soon joined by dozens of other passengers whose voices simply vanished, absorbed by the growing sound entities that moved through the ship like invisible predators. These voiceless passengers could still hear normally, but they existed in enforced silence, unable to communicate except through writing or gestures. Most terrifying was the discovery that the sound entities were not just absorbing voices, they were learning to use them. Passengers began hearing their own voices speaking words they had never said, delivering messages in their own tones and speech patterns, but expressing thoughts and emotions that felt alien and wrong. Sarah Kim, a psychology professor from Seattle, heard her own voice calling to her from empty corridors, begging her to feed the silence, and give the sounds what they need to grow. The ship's communication systems became completely unreliable as the sound entities infiltrated all audio equipment. Phone calls between passengers would be interrupted by voices from other conversations. Radio communications with shore were garbled with sounds from the ship's various entertainment venues, and the PA system began broadcasting a cacophony of stolen voices all speaking at once in a linguistic chaos that hurt to listen to. Captain Elena Morrison attempted to contact maritime authorities, but found that all outgoing communications were being intercepted and modified by the sound entities. Messages sent by radio would arrive at their destinations completely altered, often containing warnings about acoustic dangers delivered in the captain's own voice, but expressing ideas she had never spoken. The ship had become acoustically isolated from the outside world, trapped in a bubble of predatory sound. The climax of the horror occurred when the sound entities began manifesting as semi-physical beings. Passengers reported seeing humanoid figures made of flowing visible sound moving through the ship's corridors. These beings appeared to be constructed from thousands of stolen voices, conversations, and musical notes, creating entities that were simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. They moved with purpose, seeking out passengers who still retained their voices and surrounding them with waves of sound that gradually drained their ability to produce audible speech. Jessica Morrison, whose musical training made her particularly sensitive to the acoustic phenomena, discovered that the sound entities were not randomly absorbing voices. They were building something. The stolen sounds were being woven together into a complex acoustic structure that resembled a massive musical composition, but one that existed in the parallel sound realm she could glimpse from the ship's silent zones. The entities were creating a sonic world where they could exist independently of human hosts. The most disturbing revelation came when Jessica realized that passengers who had lost their voices weren't just silent. They were gradually being absorbed into the acoustic realm themselves. She watched through the ship's windows as voiceless passengers became translucent, their physical forms beginning to merge with the flowing sound shapes that swam through the parallel ocean. They were becoming part of the acoustic entity's growing composition, their consciousness preserved but transformed into living musical instruments. Dr. Foster made a desperate attempt to reverse the process by using the ship's audio systems to create a counter-frequency that might disrupt the sound entities. But her efforts only attracted more acoustic predators, and the ship became filled with a haunting chorus of stolen voices, all singing the same wordless melody in perfect harmony. The sound was beautiful and terrifying, expressing emotions that no human throat could produce, and promising transformations that no living person should desire. When the harmony of the seas finally returned to port, maritime authorities found a ship where nearly half the passengers and crew could no longer speak. The official report cited a viral infection affecting the vocal cords, but those who had experienced the acoustic nightmare knew better. The voiceless passengers were quietly transferred to specialized facilities for treatment that would never restore what they had lost. The ship underwent extensive renovation of its audio systems, but the silent zones persisted despite all attempts to eliminate them. Subsequent cruises reported continued acoustic anomalies, and the ship's entertainment venues were eventually closed to passengers. Staff members worked in these areas only during daylight hours and never alone, as the sound entities seemed to be most active in darkness and isolation. Jessica Morrison never regained her full vocal range. Her voice carried an otherworldly quality that seemed to resonate with frequencies beyond normal human hearing, and sometimes, when she sang, listeners claimed they could hear harmonies that weren't there, echoes of the vast acoustic composition. that continued to grow somewhere in the spaces between sound and silence. She lived in constant awareness that part of her voice remained trapped in that parallel realm, contributing to a symphony that would play forever in the depths of acoustic space, where stolen sounds lived as predatory entities that fed on the music of human communication. The Virgin Voyages. Scarlet Lady was 3 days into its 7-night Caribbean cruise when passengers began noticing that some of their fellow travelers looked remarkably similar to people they had seen earlier in the voyage, but wearing different faces. What started as casual observations about family resemblances would evolve into a nightmare, where human skin became a commodity that could be traded, stolen, and worn like clothing, leaving the ship populated by passengers who were no longer entirely who they appeared to be. It began with Rebecca Martinez, a dermatologist from Miami, who had booked the cruise to escape the stress of her medical practice. On the morning of the 4th day, she was having breakfast when she noticed something that made her almost choke on her coffee. The elderly woman sitting 2 tables away looked exactly like Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, a passenger Rebecca had spoken with the previous evening. But this woman appeared to be at least 30 years younger, with smooth, unwrinkled skin and bright, youthful eyes. The bone structure was identical, the mannerisms were the same, but the skin was completely different. Rebecca approached the woman, expecting to find Eleanor's daughter, or perhaps a much younger sister. Instead, she found Eleanor herself, speaking in the same voice and sharing the same memories from their previous conversation. When Rebecca mentioned how young Eleanor looked, the elderly woman smiled with skin that belonged on someone in their 20s and said, "Oh, I just found something that works wonders for my complexion. You should try it too, dear." Dr. Patricia Santos, the ship's chief medical officer, initially dismissed Rebecca's concerns as confusion between family members. But Dr. Santos became alarmed when she began receiving reports from passengers complaining of skin that felt loose or borrowed. Many described sensations of their skin not fitting properly, as if they were wearing clothing that was slightly the wrong size. Others reported feeling like their faces were masks that might slip off if they moved too quickly. The first definitive proof that something was wrong came when Thomas Chen, a photographer from San Francisco, reviewed the pictures he had been taking throughout the cruise. In his photos from day 1, a young couple named David and Sarah Kim appeared as attractive people in their 30s. By day 3, the same couple appeared in his photos as elderly individuals with wrinkled skin and age spots. But in day 4 photos, they were children, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, wearing adult clothing that hung loosely on their small frames. Yet, when Thomas approached them, they insisted they were the same people and seemed genuinely confused by his concerns about their changing appearances. The ship's salon and spa became the center of increasingly disturbing reports. Maria Rodriguez, a beautician working in the ship's wellness center, noticed that some of her clients' skin was behaving strangely during treatments. Facials would reveal skin underneath that looked completely different from the surface layer, as if passengers were wearing sophisticated masks. When she tried to apply moisturizer to one client, the woman's skin began to peel away in large sheets, revealing entirely different skin underneath. Younger, smoother, but somehow wrong, as if it didn't belong to the same person. The spa's most popular treatment was a new procedure called renewal therapy, which promised to restore youthful appearance through a proprietary skin treatment developed exclusively for the cruise line. Passengers who underwent this treatment emerged looking decades younger, but with subtle changes that went beyond mere age reduction. Their facial features would be slightly different, their skin tone might shift, and occasionally they would have completely different eye colors or hair textures than when they entered the treatment room. Dr. Helen Foster, a plastic surgeon traveling as a passenger, became suspicious when she observed that the skin changes were too dramatic to be explained by any known cosmetic procedure. She convinced several passengers to allow her to examine them, and what she found defied medical explanation. The renewed skin wasn't regenerated tissue. It was actual skin that had been removed from other sources and somehow grafted onto the patients without any surgical procedure. The cellular structure showed that the skin belonged to different people, different ages, and in some cases, different ethnicities than the passengers wearing it. The horrible truth began to emerge when passengers started recognizing their own skin on other people. Linda Walsh, a teacher from Seattle, watched in horror as a man she didn't recognize walked past wearing her exact facial features. He had her nose, her cheekbones, her eye shape, and even her distinctive birthmark, but he was clearly a different person underneath. When Linda looked in a mirror, she found that her own face had been replaced with features that belonged to someone else entirely, though she had no memory of undergoing any procedure. The ship's medical records revealed that the renewal therapy wasn't removing years from passengers' appearances. It was literally removing skin from some passengers and applying it to others. The spa staff, led by a mysterious figure known only as Dr. Rostov, had developed a technique for harvesting human skin and transplanting it onto willing clients who paid premium prices for the procedure. But the process had evolved beyond simple cosmetic surgery into something far more sinister. Rebecca Martinez made a terrifying discovery when she investigated the spa's restricted areas during off hours. In the lower levels of the wellness center, she found what could only be described as a skin farm, rooms lined with tanks containing human skin in various stages of preservation and processing. The skin was organized by age, ethnicity, and physical characteristics, like a warehouse of human appearances waiting to be distributed to customers. Most disturbing was that much of the skin appeared to be harvested from passengers who were still alive and walking around the ship. The harvesting process was more sophisticated than simple surgery. Dr. Rostov had developed a technique that could remove skin without leaving scars or wounds, peeling it away like clothing while leaving the underlying tissue intact. The donors would then be fitted with replacement skin taken from other sources, creating a cycle where appearances could be traded and exchanged among passengers without anyone initially realizing what had happened. The Virgin Voyages. Scarlet Lady was 3 days into its 7-night Caribbean cruise when passengers began noticing that some of their fellow travelers looked remarkably similar to people they had seen earlier in the voyage, but wearing different faces. What started as casual observations about family resemblances would evolve into a nightmare, where human skin became a commodity that could be traded, stolen, and worn like clothing, leaving the ship populated by passengers who were no longer entirely who they appeared to be. It began with Rebecca Martinez, a dermatologist from Miami, who had booked the cruise to escape the stress of her medical practice. On the morning of the 4th day, she was having breakfast when she noticed something that made her almost choke on her coffee. The elderly woman sitting 2 tables away looked exactly like Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, a passenger Rebecca had spoken with the previous evening. But this woman appeared to be at least 30 years younger, with smooth, unwrinkled skin and bright, youthful eyes. The bone structure was identical, the mannerisms were the same, but the skin was completely different. Rebecca approached the woman, expecting to find Eleanor's daughter, or perhaps a much younger sister. Instead, she found Eleanor herself, speaking in the same voice and sharing the same memories from their previous conversation. When Rebecca mentioned how young Eleanor looked, The elderly woman smiled with skin that belonged on someone in their 20s and said, "Oh, I just found something that works wonders for my complexion. You should try it too, dear." Dr. Patricia Santos, the ship's chief medical officer, initially dismissed Rebecca's concerns as confusion between family members. But Dr. Santos became alarmed when she began receiving reports from passengers complaining of skin that felt loose or borrowed. Many described sensations of their skin not fitting properly, as if they were wearing clothing that was slightly the wrong size. Others reported feeling like their faces were masks that might slip off if they moved too quickly. The first definitive proof that something was wrong came when Thomas Chen, a photographer from San Francisco, reviewed the pictures he had been taking throughout the cruise. In his photos from day one, a young couple named David and Sarah Kim appeared as attractive people in their 30s. By day 3, the same couple appeared in his photos as elderly individuals with wrinkled skin and age spots. But in day 4 photos, they were children, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, wearing adult clothing that hung loosely on their small frames. Yet, when Thomas approached them, they insisted they were the same people and seemed genuinely confused by his concerns about their changing appearances. The ship's salon and spa became the center of increasingly disturbing reports. Maria Rodriguez, a beautician working in the ship's wellness center, noticed that some of her clients' skin was behaving strangely during treatments. Facials would reveal skin underneath that looked completely different from the surface layer, as if passengers were wearing sophisticated masks. When she tried to apply moisturizer to one client, the woman's skin began to peel away in large sheets, revealing entirely different skin underneath. Younger, smoother, but somehow wrong, as if it didn't belong to the same person. The spa's most popular treatment was a new procedure called renewal therapy, which promised to restore youthful appearance through a proprietary skin treatment developed exclusively for the cruise line. Passengers who underwent this treatment emerged looking decades younger, but with subtle changes that went beyond mere age reduction. Their facial features would be slightly different, their skin tone might shift, and occasionally they would have completely different eye colors or hair textures than when they entered the treatment room. Dr. Helen Foster, a plastic surgeon traveling as a passenger, became suspicious when she observed that the skin changes were too dramatic to be explained by any known cosmetic procedure. She convinced several passengers to allow her to examine them, and what she found defied medical explanation. The renewed skin wasn't regenerated tissue. It was actual skin that had been removed from other sources and somehow grafted onto the patients without any surgical procedure. The cellular structure showed that the skin belonged to different people, different ages, and in some cases, different ethnicities than the passengers wearing it. The horrible truth began to emerge when passengers started recognizing their own skin on other people. Linda Walsh, a teacher from Seattle, watched in horror as a man she didn't recognize walked past wearing her exact facial features. He had her nose, her cheekbones, her eye shape, and even her distinctive birthmark, but he was clearly a different person underneath. When Linda looked in a mirror, she found that her own face had been replaced with features that belonged to someone else entirely, though she had no memory of undergoing any procedure. The ship's medical records revealed that the renewal therapy wasn't removing years from passengers' appearances. It was literally removing skin from some passengers and applying it to others. The spa staff, led by a mysterious figure known only as Dr. Rostov, had developed a technique for harvesting human skin and transplanting it onto willing clients who paid premium prices for the procedure. But the process had evolved beyond simple cosmetic surgery into something far more sinister. Rebecca Martinez made a terrifying discovery when she investigated the spa's restricted areas during off hours. In the lower levels of the wellness center, she found what could only be described as a skin farm, rooms lined with tanks containing human skin in various stages of preservation and processing. The skin was organized by age, ethnicity, and physical characteristics, like a warehouse of human appearances waiting to be distributed to customers. Most disturbing was that much of the skin appeared to be harvested from passengers who were still alive and walking around the ship. The harvesting process was more sophisticated than simple surgery. Dr. Rostov had developed a technique that could remove skin without leaving scars or wounds, peeling it away like clothing while leaving the underlying tissue intact. The donors would then be fitted with replacement skin taken from other sources, creating a cycle where appearances could be traded and exchanged among passengers without anyone initially realizing what had happened. But the procedure had unexpected side effects. Passengers who had undergone skin exchanges began exhibiting the personality traits and memories of the original skin donors. Linda Walsh, wearing someone else's face, started speaking with a different accent and craving foods she had never liked. Robert Chen, whose elderly skin had been replaced with that of a teenager, began behaving with childlike enthusiasm and had difficulty remembering events from his adult life. The skin trades were creating identity confusion throughout the ship. Families couldn't recognize each other when parents and children swapped ages through skin exchanges. Married couples found themselves attracted to strangers wearing their spouse's familiar faces while feeling repulsed by their actual partner's new appearances. The ship became populated by people who looked like passengers who had died, children who had the faces of elderly grandparents, and adults wearing the smooth, unmarked skin of newborn babies. Dr. Santos discovered that the skin exchanges were becoming involuntary. Passengers would wake up with different faces than they had gone to sleep with, having no memory of agreeing to any procedure. The spa staff was conducting harvesting operations on unconscious passengers, taking premium skin from attractive young people and distributing it to paying customers while leaving the donors with inferior replacement skin taken from elderly or less attractive sources. The horror escalated when passengers realized that some of the skin being used in the procedures wasn't from living donors. Dr. Foster's examination revealed that portions of the skin inventory came from deceased individuals, including passengers who had died on previous cruises. The ship was recycling skin from the dead, allowing passengers to literally wear the faces of corpses while the original owners had been buried or cremated with someone else's appearance. Margaret Thompson, a retired nurse from Portland, made the most disturbing discovery when she found patients in the spa's hidden medical wing who had been completely skinned. These individuals were kept alive, but in a state of constant agony, their exposed muscle and nerve tissue wrapped in temporary synthetic coverings while they awaited new skin grafts. Some had been in this condition for days or weeks, conscious but unable to communicate their suffering, while Dr. Rostov and his staff used their harvested skin to fulfill the cosmetic desires of paying passengers. The ship's ventilation system became contaminated with shed skin cells from the constant harvesting and grafting procedures. Passengers began developing respiratory problems from breathing the microscopic skin particles, and many reported tasting something organic and unpleasant in the air. The entire vessel had become an environment saturated with human tissue, creating an atmosphere that felt claustrophobic and wrong on a cellular level. Captain William Morrison attempted to shut down the spa operations when the extent of the skin trafficking became clear, but found that a significant portion of his crew had been replaced with individuals wearing stolen identities. The real crew members were imprisoned in the spa's medical facilities, skinned and kept alive while imposters wearing their faces operated the ship. Captain Morrison himself was no longer certain whether he was looking at his real reflection in mirrors or at someone else's face that had been grafted onto his skull. The situation reached its climax when passengers began peeling away layers of skin like clothing, revealing that some individuals had undergone multiple skin exchanges and were wearing the faces of several different people stacked on top of each other. The ship became a nightmare of shifting identities where no one could be certain of anyone's true appearance or identity. When the Scarlet Lady finally returned to port, immigration and customs officials were faced with the impossible task of identifying passengers whose faces didn't match their documentation. Many passengers had to undergo DNA testing to prove their identities, while others were detained when it became clear they were wearing the faces of people who had died or disappeared. The ship's manifest showed 3,000 passengers, but medical examination revealed that there were actually portions of over 5,000 different individuals represented among the skin grafts aboard the vessel. Rebecca Martinez never regained her original appearance. Her face had been so thoroughly reconstructed with skin from multiple donors that plastic surgeons couldn't determine what she had originally looked like. She lived with the constant unsettling knowledge that strangers' faces were staring back at her from mirrors, and that somewhere, other people might be wearing pieces of her original identity. She avoided cruise ships for the rest of her life, but could never escape the feeling that her true face was still out there somewhere, worn by someone she would never meet, living a life that should have been hers.